When you're sitting at your desk wondering whether a pre-built gaming rig is worth the money, the biggest fear is ending up with a box that looks impressive on paper but feels like a compromise once you plug it in. I've spent the last couple of weeks setting up the Skytech Gaming Edge, running it through a mix of modern AAA titles, a few indie games, and even some work-related video editing to see if the hype lines up with real-world use. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this video I'll break down exactly what you get, where the value really lies, and who should walk away before they click add to cart. First off, the Edge is positioned as a mid-high-end pre-built that promises a smooth 1080p and solid 1440p experience without forcing you to pick apart a parts list. The core of the machine is an AMD Ryzen 7 5700, an 8-core chip that sits at 3.7 GHz base and can boost up to 4.6 GHz when the workload calls for it. Pair that with an RTX 5060 graphics card that carries 8 GB of GDDR4 memory, and you have a combination that, on paper, should keep you comfortably above 60 frames per second in most current games at high settings. The 32 GB of DDR4 RAM and a 1 TB NVMe SSD also suggest you won't be waiting on load screens or fighting RAM bottlenecks. But specs are just a starting point. The real test is how they translate when you're actually gaming. I started with Cyberpunk 2077 on a 1440p monitor, because it's a title that tends to expose weak links in any system. With the Edge's default drivers, I could hold steady around 68 frames per second on high preset, and when I nudged a few settings down to medium-high, I was consistently in the low 70s. That's not a frame-perfect 144 frames per second experience, but it's smooth enough that you don't notice any stutter during fast travel or combat. The RTX 5060 isn't a flagship card, so don't expect ray tracing at max settings. However, the DLSS implementation does a respectable job of keeping the image sharp while nudging performance upward. If you're primarily playing titles like Fortnite, Valorant, or Apex Legends, you'll be hitting well over 100 frames per second on ultra settings, which means the Edge comfortably covers the competitive esports niche. Switching over to a more CPU-heavy workload, I opened Adobe Premiere Pro and tossed together a 5-minute 4K clip, adding some color correction and transitions. The Ryzen 7 handled the render preview without the kind of lag you sometimes see on lower-tier CPUs. Export times were roughly 15% faster than my old 6-core setup, which is a noticeable productivity boost if you dabble in content creation. That dual-use angle is something a lot of buyers overlook. You're not just paying for gaming. The CPU can carry a decent amount of side hustle work without feeling like you need a separate workstation. Now, let's talk about the practical aspects that often get lost when people focus purely on raw power. The chassis is a mid-tower with a high-performance air cooler that runs quietly at idle but does pick up a low hum under sustained loads. It's not a liquid-cooled monstrosity, which keeps the maintenance simple, no tubes to worry about, and the cooler's fans are easily accessible if you ever need to replace them. The front panel houses a couple of USB-C ports, 2 USB-A, and a headphone jack, which is handy for a quick plug-and-play setup. The downside? The side panel is a single sheet metal without a tempered glass window, so if you like showing off internal RGB or want to monitor component temperatures at a glance, you'll miss that aesthetic element. One hidden trade-off shows up when you think about future upgrades. The power supply is a 650W gold-rated unit, which is ample for the current configuration, but the PSU isn't modular. That means you'll have a bundle of cables running inside the case, which can make airflow a little tighter if you ever decide to swap in a more power-hungry GPU later on. For most gamers staying within the 1080p 1440p range, that won't be a deal-breaker. But if you plan to jump to 4K or add multiple drives down the line, you might hit a ceiling sooner than you'd like. Another point that's worth mentioning is the Wi-Fi module. It's an 802.11 AC adapter that works fine for most broadband connections, but if you have a gigabit fiber plan and rely heavily on wireless, you may notice a slight dip compared to a dedicated Wi-Fi 6 card. The Edge does include an Ethernet port, so plugging directly into your router eliminates that variable completely. In practice, I ran the PC over a wired connection for gaming, and latency was negligible. The wireless performance would likely be adequate for streaming movies or browsing, just not for the most demanding online battles. So, who should walk away with a purchase, and who should keep looking? If you're a casual gamer who wants a system that just works out of the box, enjoys the occasional indie title, and doesn't want to fuss with building or troubleshooting, the Edge is a solid